this is my review of Thus Spoke Kishibe Rohan. Okay, so in this episode of Thus Spoke Kishibe Rohan, this episode is actually kind of interesting because it details a yokai encounter that Rohan had once and the subsequent story behind it. So it starts off with Rohan actually meeting up with his editor, Minoru Kagemori, but Kagemori is 6 minutes early to the meeting, and it is also very unprofessional because while Rohan remarks that he is a very respected person in the industry, he doesn't really know how to act in a meeting. So he shows up. Rohan is actually reading it over through an art book of a famous artist, which Minoru actually remarks he thinks is a rock band. But as they're getting ready to start the meeting, Akira Otoshi, who has since been released from prison, if you guys remember, he was arrested back in part 4, and Tamami actually show up asking Rohan for an autograph, pointing out that they are big fans, and that since he kind of lives in town, and even though it's unclear when this is clearly set after part 4, but it's clear that it is clear that Tamami knows Rohan at this point, so it's a little bit weird why he's asking for an autograph. But while Minoru tries to chase them off, pointing out that Rohan doesn't have time to actually give them autographs and that they need to leave him be, in the time it takes him to say that, Rohan actually successfully does it using the straw from his coffee as well as his own coffee itself to actually create a drip artwork autograph for both of the men. And the two stand users thank him and go on their merry way. At which point Rohan explains the purpose behind the meeting. As it turns out, Rohan bought basically, long story short, Rohan bought the titular Mutsu-kabe hill in an effort to stop a development project. And because of that, he's actually flat broke. So, yeah, as it turns out, he's been living with Koichi for an unknown amount of time. He sold basically everything he owned, including his house, and he doesn't really have a workspace, and he needs an advance on his pay because he needs to be able to buy all of his stuff back so he can move back in and buy all of his things back so he can go back to living the same lifestyle that he had, and also be able to afford his own house. And he ultimately also goes on to explain how the reason he bought the entire village is because he was trying to halt a development project because as I said at the start of this review, Rohan strongly believes there's a yokai living on Mutsu-kabe Hill, and he believed that the development companies would have scared it off if they had just tried to build any sort of resort or anything like that they were trying to build there. So in order to get them to back off, he bought the mountain and the surrounding areas. And while Minoru ultimately plays it off as Rohan being a little bit off his nut, pointing out that is a little bit outrageous for him to buy this big massive expansive area, especially since he only bought it for manga research and not real estate, which is what you should be expected to do when you buy any sort of land, because the land does not depreciate. As it turns out, Rohan confirms that, yes, he does admit it's a little bit weird, but then ultimately explains that his entire that him actually buying the land actually paid off because he did find the yokai he was looking for, and then proceeds to explain the monster of Mutsu-kabe Hill. So at which point he then proceeds to tell his editor a story. So it starts off with a woman named Naoto Ota, who for long story short lives there with her family, who basically more or less own the village. They own the village. They produce all of the things that they make from there. And long story short, they just own the village and the surrounding land. Which is why they ultimately own the land, but apparently we're trying to sell it to make a resort on it, but that's not the point of the story. But in any case, In any case, Naoto has a boyfriend named Gunpei, and Rohan begins the story by stating that she unintentionally murdered her boyfriend. So, at which point he proceeds to tell the story of how that actually happened. As it turns out, Naoto, she's currently with her boyfriend, who is currently playing video games in the living room, and Naoto ultimately tells him to get out, pointing out that her father and boyfriend and what is later revealed to be her fiance are actually coming home, and that she can't, and that he needs to leave. And at which point Gunpei accurately concludes that she is seeing another guy behind his back. And she ultimately tells him that there's really no other explanation that's needed, and also pays him to try and get him to leave, pointing out that the run they had was actually pretty good, but that ultimately he needs to leave because she can't be seen with the gardener man anymore, and that ultimately she needs to think about what's best for her family. But Gunpei is unwilling to actually let her go, as it were, and quite literally grabs onto her and tries to undress her, pointing out that it probably wouldn't be a bad thing if her father came in and saw them together. Pointing out that he would probably approve their relationship and probably wouldn't want them to break up. But ultimately she becomes increasingly uncomfortable with his advances. So she shoves him and slaps him and tells him to knock it off. At which point he slaps her back, almost like a reflex, and ultimately recoils, realizing what he just did, and ultimately tells her that he didn't mean to slap her and that it was a reflex. At which point she shoves him, and then peeks out the window to notice that her father and fiance are actually coming down the sidewalk, and that she ultimately points out, and then she reveals that she actually is indeed engaged to another man, and it's an arranged relationships, and that even if they do love each other, they can no longer be together because of that. And asks and hopes that Gunpei will actually understand. But when she turns around, she discovers that Gunpei is dead. As it turns out, she accidentally shoved Gunpei into a bag of golf clubs, and one of them impaled itself in the back of his head, and he basically dies almost instantaneously. At which point she realizes that the danger that she's in, because she more or less killed her boyfriend by accident. So she's quickly realizing that she needs to get rid of the body to actually hide him. And she has literally no time to do it, because her father and her fiance, who is revealed to be Shuichi, are actually at the front door and trying to come in. So her first realization is that she needs to call somebody, and considers calling a doctor, pointing out that she may be able to actually save him that way, but remarks that since he's already bleeding heavily, that it might be a bad idea, and then contemplates whether or not she should call the cops. But ultimately decides against it, and as Rohan even remarks himself, despite knowing that Gunpei is probably likely already very much dead, she then proceeds to start dragging him into the kitchen in order to try and dress his wound. But as she's dragging his body into the kitchen to actually close up the wound, he starts bleeding even more, despite the fact that he's dead and his heart sort of stopped. And she's ultimately a little bit freaked out by this, because he's now bleeding everywhere, and she has no way to actually stop him. Her father and Shuichi are trying to barge into the house, pointing out that they don't really know she's home. And also he started bleeding all over her, so she takes off her nightgown to actually help try and stop up some of the blood. When her father and Shuichi try to come in, she ultimately tells them not to come in, and that she'll be with them in a minute, pointing out that she's just cleaning up the kitchen, and that she'll meet them over at the main house when she's done. And while her father accepts this as an explanation, he does give the key to Shuichi, who ultimately uses it. Who ultimately does try to use it to actually come into the house. And sure enough, as she tries to use the first aid kit to actually patch up the wound on the back of Gunpei's head to stop him from bleeding, which works very limitedly, might I add. And she becomes increasingly panicked. Shuichi quickly realizes that something is wrong, and also his own paranoia that she saw somebody else in the house. pointing out that he saw the curtains move she was explaining that to Gunpei that Shuichi and her father were coming and that they couldn't be together. And ultimately, his fears are starting to become more and more confirmed because she is starting to panic and pointing out that Gunpei is bleeding, and he can hear all of this from the front door, so he knows something is wrong. And he even tries to unlock the door to come in, at which point even stitching the wound hasn't even fixed Gunpei's wound, so she ultimately decides that the next best thing would be to wrap his head in a bag, and then wrap him in a curtain and shove him on top of the fridge, and then push the fridge away so that it looks like that so it doesn't look like Gunpei is being stuffed on top of the fridge. And it works. She somehow manages to get all the blood cleaned up before Shuichi comes into the room, at which point we actually meet him properly. And while Shuichi is more than happy that his suspicions were indeed wrong, and then proceeds to leave. As it turns out, the way that Naoto actually had to get rid of the blood and keep it from going all over the place is that she actually used a straw to actually suck up the blood herself, which she admits is disgusting, and is even sobbing because she knows that this is wrong and that she also has to keep the secret from Shuichi now. But once Shuichi leaves, she then proceeds to dispose of the body properly. So at which point we find out the rest of her story, that how after this whole incident she wound up marrying Shuichi and becoming a part of his family, and how despite of that she still had to keep Naoto still had to keep Gunpei's body a secret, stuffing him inside a box, and how he continues to bleed constantly, although it doesn't go over a certain point as long as he's not moved. So at which point Naoto keeps the entire body of Gunpei's entire body a secret by putting him in a box and then disposing of the blood discreetly so that it doesn't look like there's anything wrong. And it works. For the most part, she's never caught. Nobody ever finds out that this is actually a thing that happened. And even when the guest house is demolished, she just moves him straight into the attic. At which point she discovers a unique quirk of his biology, which is that when she sprays him with water, he temporarily returns to the handsome young man he was before he died. Because the reason for this is because is that he actually is bleeding out, which is causing his skin to become dehydrated, and he becomes mummified and pale. But actually spraying him with water seems to undo that, at least to a limited degree, which enables her to actually look at him like he was, but back when he was alive, and she actually kind of fawns over him in a kind of creepy way, which is really weird and really creepy. And it takes a bit of a darker turn in that regard, which I'm going to get to later in a minute. But in any case, it ultimately causes Rohan to ask the question of what Gunpei is. And he kind of goes to confirm his suspicions by going to Mutsu-kabe Hill, where he's actually being badgered by a real estate agent who is trying and failing to get Rohan to sell the land he bought. And as he's visiting Mutsu-kabe Hill, he actually uses Heaven's Door to gather information from Naoto to try and figure, due to a chance encounter, and by no degree a thing that Rohan actually sought out. But he managed to get information regarding Gunpei's body and try and figure out what he is, and actually went to Mutsu-kabe Hill to investigate. And then that time he actually gets separated from the realtor, and much to Rohan's joy, because he doesn't want to talk to the realtor anymore. But as he's walking away from the realtor and trying to investigate the house a little bit more, he actually runs into a little girl who he doesn't really recognize, but clearly she recognizes him because she refers to him by name and ultimately tells him that she's normally not supposed to talk to strangers because her parents tell her that the world is full of pedophiles and weirdos and stuff like that, and then proceeds to run back toward the house. At which point Rohan tries to catch up to her, and she trips and hits her head and bleeds out. At which point Rohan quickly realizes that she actually is the next host of the monster, and quickly realizes that her entire purpose is that it's likely that she's actually Gunpei and Naoto's child, and quickly realizes that the monster of Mutsu-kabe Hill's main purpose is to breed and spread itself, and also quickly realizes that if he doesn't do something, she's actually going to possess him, and he's going to have to wind up hiding her body forever. At which point he uses Heaven's Door to kind of, sort of, somehow bring her back to life. It's not entirely clear how Heaven's Door actually does this, but it's implied that once he writes the command that she does not actually know Rohan Kishibe and will not remember him when she encounters him, that somehow manages to fix her and the yokai stops possessing her, at which point she comes back to life and is completely 100% fine. And then proceeds to run off to find Naoto, telling her mom that she's hungry. At which point Rohan quickly realizes the danger that he was almost in, pointing out that he could have very easily been possessed by the yokai of Mutsu-kabe Hill, and that if he hadn't acted there, he probably would have been, the guilt probably would have set in, and he probably would have been possessed by it. At which point he realizes that how dangerous the beast of Mutsu-kabe Hill actually is. Effectively, it's a creature whose sole purpose is to reproduce, and it will possess anybody who gets too close to it, mainly by dying and using their love/guilt to actually propagate and actually get them to do its bidding. Mainly just get them to hide the body that it was possessing and bleed eternally, so that they have to take care of it forever. After concluding this story to Minoru, Josuke and his friends actually show up. Josuke we don't actually see because he only doesn't speak, and we only see the back of his head, but he is indeed there nonetheless. As well as Koichi, Okuyasu, and Mikitaka, who were just decided to show up there as well. They all proceed to discuss whether or not the story was actually true. With Koichi ultimately pointing out that it does seem like a bit of a far-fetched story, but Okuyasu, who was initially skeptical, does point out that it does seem like something that could potentially happen, and does seem a little bit scary. And Mikitaka does indeed confirm that this could indeed be something extraterrestrial in origin, pointing out that when he lived in the Mangelic Clouds, he actually saw a similar organism, and concludes that it could indeed be something similar. And while Rohan does ultimately take all of their considerations into account, and also Minoru is a little bit upset that everybody just kind of barged into on a private meeting, he ultimately stops in his tracks for a minute to actually ask Mikitaka if he is indeed an alien, which he does indeed confirm he is. Even though as we've established, it's completely ambiguous as to whether or not he is at all. But in any case, after that, Rohan then proceeds to reflect to himself what the creature actually was, and concludes that it is indeed ultimately an organism that possesses somebody, uses their ability of love to actually cause them to fall in love with it, and then kills itself in a graphic way in front of them, which causes them to become possessed, and they then proceed to take care of it forever. And it no longer has to be cared for, has to worry about life and things that would involve life, like feeding and eating and sleeping, because it gets to be taken care of forever, and that's ultimately its end goal. To spread, propagate, and then continue to be cared for by somebody. That's ultimately what its end goal is. And Rohan ultimately concludes that it is a bit of a scary creature. But as the episode ends, we actually hear a conversation, not necessarily see, because that was apparently omitted in my research of the episode. That's apparently omitted from the episode, but we actually hear a conversation between the little girl and Naoto. And the little girl actually asks Naoto if she'll ever meet a handsome man and get married, and Naoto ultimately tells her that she will eventually one day. So yeah, the Mutsu-kabe Hill. This episode is just about a yokai possessing people and then tricking them into murdering it so that it can live with them forever, which is creepy as hell given the subtext, but it is a very interesting story nonetheless. And yeah, that's ultimately all I have to. That's pretty much all I have to say about it. It is just an interesting story because this series does indeed kind of expand this whole supernatural thing regarding this JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and this episode is no exception. We already know ghosts are a thing in this world, and now apparently yokai are a thing as well, which are confirmed evil spirits. So yeah, it makes perfect sense for this episode to exist. Ghosts exist. Reimi Sugimoto was a major character for most of Part 4, so it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense that yokai would also exist in this world, and that one has decided to take up a residence on top of Mutsu-kabe Hill and is proceeded to torment the people there. So, yeah, this episode does make perfect sense if you think about it from that context. But in any case, yeah, that's my review of Thus Spoke Kishibe Rohan. What did you guys think? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord server, link in the description. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below if you want to help support the show. It's only a couple bucks a month. It really helps me out, and you guys get access to a bunch of cool perks on my saying thanks, so be sure to check those out in the description below as well. Be sure to check out my Patreon and all that. Also, be sure to check out my Twitch. I stream regularly over there, provided my schedule works out. So be sure to go check. Be sure to go check that out every Sunday at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. And also, if you want to help support me even further, then yeah, again, be sure to check that out. And also, finally, if you want to see more content from me, then be sure to check out the videos linked in the end screen. The top video is the most recent video. It may or may not be this one. Whereas the bottom video is a video I recommend to you based on what you've already seen from me. So, if you want to see more of what you like, or try something completely different, then be sure to check both of those videos out. But, regardless of whether or not you do any or all of those things, thank you guys so much for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace!